Hello everyone, and welcome to the very first video in our little rendering with V-Ray in Blender, the basics series of tutorials. My name is Nate, and I'll be your host here. The overarching plan for us here is to go through some of the very basics when it comes to the V-Ray for Blender integration, so that you know where the essentials are, well, and how you can use them. Now, in this specific tutorial, we're going to be doing an overview of the V-Ray plugin, see how the general workflow looks like, and where some of the buttons are, and just one-on-one basic things like that. Now, before we dive any deeper into things, just as a bit of a heads up, the V-Ray for Blender add-on, at least at the time of recording this video, just reached its first official release, which is definitely a big deal, and it's something we're all quite excited about because now everyone can use it. It is no longer in beta. And if you've used some of the really older V-Ray for Blender versions from the time of the dinosaurs, I suppose, then please know this version has been written from complete scratch. Okay, so with V-Ray, what you're getting is a state-of-the-art renderer that is designed to get you top-notch photorealistic results without, in the grand scheme of things, breaking too much of a sweat, while still being very versatile in the type of images it can output. We see V-Ray being used across multiple industries, including ArcViz, ProductViz, VFX, and the like, much like it is in other DCC tools. Now, V-Ray also has some really neat functionality, such as, for example, the light mix functionality, which makes it possible to change the color and the intensity of the lights in your scenes without re-rendering the image itself. This is one of V-Ray's most popular features, in my opinion. Then there's the V-Ray material, which makes creating physically accurate materials a lot easier because you don't have to mix and match different materials together to get a single realistic material going. Plus, you've got specialized materials for hair and car paints and the like. But that's not all, as you also get the V-Ray physical camera, which basically lets you control your 3D camera settings as you would on a real-world camera, which is quite handy in my opinion. Now, V-Ray also comes with a CPU and a GPU render engine. It is important to note, however, that these are two different render engines. One is called V-Ray, it works specifically on CPUs and it has the broadest feature set, and the other render engine is the V-Ray GPU render engine, which runs on your GPUs. As an interesting tidbit, V-Ray GPU also comes with hybrid rendering if that's what you're into, but we'll talk more about these things in the upcoming tutorials. And then you also get advanced caustic rendering, which makes both reflective and refractive rendering of caustic effects possible. So a really neat feature. There's also multiple built-in denoising options that can help make your render times a bit more manageable. And there is more and more things like that that makes V-Ray as popular as it is. Now, to be perfectly honest, this is basically our first V-Ray for Blender release, and so not all the features made the cut yet. But this initial version is based on the latest and greatest V-Ray 7 core, so you get V-Ray's latest rendering tech day one. Then there's still features that the team is still working hard on bringing over. Features such as, for example, the V-Ray decals, which make it downright easy to plaster decals onto things in your scenes without UV unwrapping anything, mind you. And then there's V-Ray Enmesh, which basically gives you an easy way to define a piece of geometry you want to tile across objects / surfaces at render time, etc. So basically there's features that are still incoming and are planned to be released in future versions. Okay, and now let's do some housekeeping for a bit. If you experience any issues, you can report them by clicking on the Report a Bug button in Blender's Preferences under the V-Ray menu. And if you want to see any new features added and influence where the product goes, check out the V-Ray for Blender Ideas portal. This is the main place where we keep tabs on what our users want and what do you want the development team to prioritize with regards to new features. If you'd like to partake in the V-Ray for Blender community, or if you have any sort of questions, well then also feel free to jump over on the Chaos forums where I or anyone else from our fabulous support and dev teams will gladly try and help you out. Last but not least, don't forget there's also the documentation pages. You can learn a lot by going through these as we try to make them quite detailed, and there's often visual examples of what a certain parameter does, for example. So it's a really useful place to check out. All right, okay, with that, I guess, intro behind us, What we're gonna do now is we're gonna hop into Blender and we're gonna have a look at how things work. Okay, so V-Ray for Blender comes in the form of an add-on. Now we're going to skip the how to install V-Ray for Blender part because it's rather easy. In essence, you just need to click next a couple of times. But once the installation is done, you can open up Blender, go into your preferences, then add-ons, and in here you can now just enable V-Ray. Once you've done that, you can then select V-Ray from the render engine list in your render properties window. Now, because V-Ray is an add-on, that means that internally Blender will recognize it needs to change certain parts of the UI to accommodate the render engine of choice. So for example, once you've switched over to V-Ray, you'll see that up here you now get a V-Ray menu in which reside the shortcuts to the most common features of the render engine. If you bring up the Shift-A menu, you'll also be able to see that you now have a couple of new entries in here. So for example, you can now create new V-Ray lights a lot more efficiently because they're now exposed to you through this menu as well. In addition to that, you'll now also be able to see that the shader node editor now changed to the V-Ray node editor. That is because with V-Ray, you'll be using different kinds of nodes than, for example, you did with cycles, because, you know, V-Ray is not cycles and it works differently and all that. On top of that, if you switch the node editor to the world mode, you'll get access to V-Ray's environment settings, its effect settings. This is where you add environment fog, for example, and also a place where you can add view layers, render channels, render passes, render elements, or however else you want to call them. If you hit Shift-A, you'll notice things are essentially sorted based on categories, meaning things that you'll probably want to plug into the render channels, for example, are under the render channels category. And the same goes for effects as well. In object mode, you can set special V-Ray related object properties to the currently selected objects. If you're by any chance a 3ds Max user, this is sort of equivalent to object properties and also the displacement modifier. And if you're a Cinema 4D user, then this is pretty much the V-Ray object tag workflow you got here. Now, as another note, in terms of the UI, is that you'll see new object settings you can tweak, and the V-Ray specific ones are highlighted a bit differently as they have the V-Ray icon in front of their title. Eagle-eyed amongst you might also notice that we have a V-Ray specific property or setting here called the V-Ray object properties. And this one has a couple of settings that match some of those we've seen in the node editor when in object mode. So sometimes there's duplicate properties, and if you change one of them in either of the locations, the other one in the other location will also update accordingly. Now, just to prove that point again, just so it really sinks in, if we, for example, go under the View Layer Properties menu here, and if we add a render channel this way, so we're just going to add a multi-matte render channel, you're going to see that that render channel is also going to get added in the node view, in the node editor when in world mode, right? And vice versa, if I delete it from in here, it's also going to get, well, not deleted, but disabled in the View Layer Properties menu. Okay, so just keep in mind that you can toggle things on and off from multiple places sometimes. Okay, so now as you were able to see, the UI and the UX in Blender will change a bit once you set your render to V-Ray. This makes working with V-Ray easier, obviously, because it puts V-Ray related things a bit more closer to you. That said, not everything adapts to the V-Ray workflow, at least not currently. We are still working on things, so you might still see some of cycle stuff around, and that stuff might work or it might not work with V-Ray, or vice versa, of course. We're going to be taking a look at the two render engines that you have available with V-Ray, because yes, there's two of them, and while they do produce similar looking results, it is important to be aware of the fact that they are two different render engines. Now, one render engine is the V-Ray render engine, while the other is the V-Ray GPU render engine. V-Ray is the CPU version, meaning it does all of its calculations on the CPU. V-Ray GPU, on the other hand, works primarily on GPUs, although CPUs are supported as well through hybrid rendering. Now, in terms of feature sets, V-Ray is known for its extensive set of features and it supports everything, whereas V-Ray GPU doesn't quite fully support everything that you will find in V-Ray. The developers, however, are working on closing the remaining gap. Which one you should pick depends on, well, you and the kind of projects you do and the kind of hardware you're invested in or want to be invested in. If you're heavy on the CPU hardware, if you need all the features or are working on really large scenes, well then V-Ray is probably your best choice. On the other hand, if you've got a bunch of NVIDIA GPUs, because yes, currently only NVIDIA hardware is supported, and if you aren't working with really large scenes, which I guess doesn't quite matter as much if you've got a ton of VRAM, or for example, if you simply prefer the typically faster / more power efficient rendering speeds of GPUs, well then maybe V-Ray GPU is the better fit for you. Very broadly speaking, V-Ray is often considered as the fullest renderer, but CPUs are a little harder to scale as you can't quite fit many of them into one single computer, although arguably you could say much the same for modern GPUs, I suppose. And V-Ray GPU, on the other hand, is often considered to be a bit more interactive speed-wise compared to V-Ray, because GPUs, especially in simpler scenes, tend to render faster, especially if you look at how much a high-end GPU costs compared to a high-end CPU. But all that said, as with any tech these days, these things are sort of in a flux, and it's hard to make a proper one-to-one comparison, right? Ultimately, it's your choice, and V-Ray gives you the ability to choose. Now, for what it's worth, I will mainly be working on a 64-core Threadripper throughout this series here. Okay, now at this point, maybe just as a little bit of a note, with V-Ray GPU, you can also do something called hybrid rendering, which means you can leverage both your GPUs and CPUs to do the rendering. This is a rather unique feature, as you can imagine, and it can come especially in handy if, for example, you're transitioning your workflows or render farms even from CPUs to GPUs or vice versa. Besides that, it obviously also gives you the ability to use both your GPUs and CPUs to render out a single image, which, as you can imagine, does have some speed benefits, right? Although, that said, do keep in mind that hybrid rendering on CPU, generally speaking, isn't as fast or as power efficient as it's rendering with V-Ray, because V-Ray is especially optimized for CPUs. So there is a performance difference that is expected there. Now, in case you do want to do hybrid rendering, you're first going to want to select your rendering devices in the V-Ray GPU device selection app. So to bring up the app, just hit the Windows button on your keyboard and then type in select, and that should present you with the select devices for V-Ray GPU rendering app. Just click on it, and then what you can do is you can just select the device you want to do GPU rendering on whenever you're in CUDA mode, of course, because this does not work for the RTX mode, right? With the RTX mode, you can only render on GPUs. When in CUDA mode, you can do hybrid rendering, okay? Now, you can also decide which device will do denoising. So we only have one GPU here. We're gonna want this one to do the denoising. And because we only have one graphics card in this workstation, we're also going to tick this low priority button here, which is just going to make the rendering experience a bit more interactive and pleasant. Now, once you've done that, you can open up Blender, make sure that the V-Ray engine here is set to V-Ray GPU, and then also make sure that this use RTX checkbox here is unchecked. And just like that, you're gonna be doing hybrid rendering. Now, for a more detailed comparison of the two render engines, do check out our documentation pages and our blog posts. We'll have some interesting links in the description of this video, and we would really recommend you give them a look, okay? Okay, now, ultimately, depending on the render engine you pick, the render settings will change accordingly, because remember, these are two different render engines after all, right? And since V-Ray GPU doesn't quite fully support everything that V-Ray does, do note that the UI won't hide those features for you, meaning there will be situations where you will try using a functionality of some sorts, but the rendering won't update as expected, and that might be because that feature isn't quite fully supported on the V-Ray GPU just yet. So do keep that in mind, please, and also keep in mind that the developers are trying to narrow the remaining gap between the two render engines. Okay, at this point, maybe we can also mention that there is a thing called the V-Ray benchmark, which anyone can download for free, mind you, and then you can see how fast your system is compared to other systems that got benchmarked. Obviously, within the benchmark itself, you can select whether you want to benchmark your system using V-Ray or V-Ray GPU. And V-Ray GPU obviously also includes the hybrid mode as well. Now, the benchmark is really useful because, for one, you can assess whether your system is working as well as it should. If your system scores considerably lower than a system with a comparable CPU or GPU setup, well, then your system might not be working as it should. Do remember, though, that you probably want to look at averages instead of highest ranking results, because highest ranking results are often overclocked, so do keep that in mind. Additionally, the benchmark can also be useful to assess your upgrade path. So if your CPU, for example, scores about half as much as the CPU you maybe want to upgrade to, well then, as you can imagine, you're probably looking at double the render speed with the upgrade, right? And obviously the same holds true for GPUs as well. In CG, materials play a crucial role in how our scenes, products, and characters look like. They're one of the most essential ingredients there is to a render, and I think we can all kind of agree on that one. That is why in V-Ray for Blender, you have a couple of different options on how you can create materials. You can use the AI material generator to create materials from the photos you take, or you can use Chaos Cosmos to simply import existing materials from the Cosmos library, which, by the way, also includes scanned materials called Chaos Scans. Or you can create your materials from complete scratch using any of the V-Ray materials. Now, in this video, we're going to have a look at how the general workflows look like, and we're going to be starting with the AI material generation. So first up, what you'll typically need is a photo of the material you want to recreate in your scene. You can either get it online, just to make sure that you respect people's sort of licensing terms and all that, right? Or you can actually snap one yourself. In which case, take your camera, phone, or mirrorless, or whatever, try not to snap any selfies, and take as good as a picture of your material as you can. Obviously, the better the photo, the better the material will look like when generated. Now, as you can probably imagine, the typical tips apply. Always try to snap the photo from a perpendicular position to your material and with even uniform lighting if possible. And if it's a large surface with a lot of patterns in it, try to snap the photo in a way so that you get as much of the surface in your picture as you can. Then in Blender, just bring up the Chaos Cosmos browser, go under the materials category, and then down here, you're going to be able to see that you have this AI material generator, generate button, click on it. And then in here, it's where you want to drop your image. So let's do that. And then let's also click on this pattern utility button, and we're gonna generate a smart pattern by clicking on the smart pattern button. So what this is just going to select a repeating pattern for you automatically. You can at any point obviously also use these handles here to adjust the crop box yourself, right? Right. Now, once you're happy with it, just hit apply. And then if you want to, you can play with these additional settings right here. So for resolution, most people will probably prefer 2K over 1K here. So we're going to select 2K. And then you can decide whether you want to delight the texture. So if you want to delight it, make sure that the preserve colors here toggle is set to off. In our case here, we want to have it actually to be set to on. And then what you can also do is you can make the texture tileable or not, or play with the, controls for the strength of the bump and surface details or the roughness, etc., etc. Now, once you're happy with these settings, just hit the generate button, then the processing is going to start. The processing will take some time. And just so you know, all the processing happens on the cloud and not locally. Now, once the processing is done, you're going to be able to see the preview of your material along with the albedo, normal, and roughness maps. Just hit the download button whenever you're ready. Give this thing a cool name because it's going to be saved in the Cosmos browser. In our case, we're going to call it the Cool Floor B material, I guess. We're going to hit save. We're going to wait for the processing to finish here. And then you can just import this thing into your scene. Now, once it's imported, you can just, apply it to your materials. So in this case, let's just search for it. We've got a lot of materials in the scene, but there we go. There it is. And now it's in our scene. As you can see, this is a fully tweakable material. You can tweak it as you wish. And you also already have a bit of a mapping setup already sort of laid out here. Now, in order to fix the scale here, probably what you would want to do in this case is bring in a V-Ray transform node, plug it into the UVW or texture transform slot. We're going to go with texture transform, and then play with the scale parameters, right? And there we go. we have our AI material generated material in our scene. Now, if you don't want to bother with snapping photos and you just want to use what already comes with V-Ray, you can simply open up Chaos Cosmos and just use the material library that comes with it. So you have a bunch of different categories of materials to choose from, so there's really quite a lot to pick from. Of course, if you'd like to know more about a given material, you can bring up the bigger preview window, and then you'll see more info about that material here. If you like a material, you can hit the download button, wait for it to download, and once it's downloaded, you just simply and easily import it into your scene by hitting the import button. In your scene, you can then apply to any objects you'd like. Plus, as you can see, you also have control over the material's properties, so you can change things up if you'd like to do so. And again, a thing to note, you also have these UV mapping nodes already in to control the mapping. Now, in the Cosmos library, you'll also be able to find materials that have this particular tag to them. These materials are chaos scans, which means they're pretty much exact replicas of real-world materials by means of them being meticulously scanned by some rather sophisticated machinery. These types of materials tend to be of really high quality and higher file sizes because essentially each material's unique properties and the way that it reacts to light are scanned and incorporated into the downloadable material that you then import into your scene. Now, the way you use them is rather easy and straightforward. Find the material you like. If you haven't yet, download it, and then just import it into your scene just like you would any other material. You'll see that even though these are scanned materials, you can still control some aspects of them. So, for example, triplanar mapping might be something you'll want to toggle often if you don't have properly made UVs. But beyond that, the paint color, if you change that, you can change the color of the material itself, which can be, in my opinion, very useful. Now, obviously, you're encouraged to play around with the other customization options as well, but we won't really cover them in this particular video. All in all, chaos scans can be incredibly awesome, and I personally tend to use them a lot. Okay, now beyond the workflows we just showcased, you can of course also build materials from complete scratch. The most often used material for this is the V-Ray material, as it gives you the ability to create pretty much any materials you'd want. So you can very quickly, for example, create glass materials. We have a new fresh V-Ray material here in front of us, and we're just going to lower its diffuse color to pure black. We're going to enable reflections, and as a bonus tip, if you go under your materials properties here under reflection and reflection advanced, and if you toggle this reflect on backside to on here, you're going to be calculating, or you're going to get V-Ray to calculate those backside reflections as well. Then we just want to make this thing refractive as well, and just like that we have our glass material. Now, if by any chance you want to have a tinted glass material, just go into refraction here, translucency, and then set the fog color to whatever color you'd like, really, and play around with the depth parameter. And there you go. There you have your tinted glass material. If, however, you're creating more diffuse, non-refractive materials, well then, just, bring in your albedo or diffuse texture, and just plug it into the bitmap node, which is what I'm doing right here, and then plug this thing into the diffuse color, right? So now you're going to see that the mapping is kind of off. We're going to very quickly fix that by bringing in a UVW mapping node. We're going to plug it into the mapping sort of input node field inside our V-Ray bitmap. And then we're going to set its projection here to planar, because I think that's going to work well enough. Now, we do want to scale this up just a little bit, I suppose. So we're going to bring in a V-Ray transform node as well. We can plug this into the UVW transform or the text transform here. We're going to go and plug it into the text transform. I think that's going to work best for us here. And I'm just going to make this thing a little bit bigger by adjusting the scale, right? Right. Now, at this point, typically what you want to do is you want to enable reflections, and because we have a roughness map here, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to toggle this use roughness toggle here to on, so we can plug our roughness map in here instead of being bound to this glossiness parameter. We're going to change the glossiness to roughness. It's essentially what we're doing here. Okay, and then we can just take this roughness map and plug it into the roughness slot here. Then also make sure that the mapping matches what we did for our diffuse map there. Now for our normal map that we have here, first what we want to do is we want to make sure that its transfer function is set to linear. And then we're going to bring in a V-Ray normal bump node. We're going to plug our normal map into the map slot here. And then we're going to plug everything into the bump map slot, just like this. Now with the V-Ray normal bump selected, make sure that the map type here is set accordingly. In most situations, it is the correct option is normal map and tangent space, but you do have all these other options here as well. Okay, then you can adjust the normal map multiplier, so the strength of it, etc., etc. So you have a bunch of different controls here then. Also, in this case, you do want to make sure that the mapping is again set correctly. So we're just going to drag that V-Ray UVW mapping sort of setup into, well, to drive the normal map as well. And for the most part, that's the general workflow for pretty much creating any type of a material. Of course, you will probably want to tweak things and introduce imperfections and whatnot, so that you get this material looking, well, even more detailed, right? Now, the cool thing here is that the V-Ray material is a so-called Uber material that lets you recreate the vast majority of real-world materials without really needing to, or having to mix multiple materials together. Most often, V-Ray material is the way to go, and if you want to blend multiple materials together, then you can just use the blend material to do that. Now, on top of that, you've got a bunch of other materials as well that you can use that are, different to the V-Ray material, and these are more specialized materials that you might want to use when you're recreating very specific materials, or want some really specific controls that the V-Ray material can't give you. Lighting is typically one of the most important parts of any image, CG or real world. With it, you can define a mood and feel of a scene, which can range anywhere from a cozy afternoon, warm type feel to something a bit more Scandinavian, or even a more serene nighttime setup. Even more so, it can really up the perceived quality of your rendered images, just by simply making things feel more polished and intentional, which makes things look more professional. On top of all of that, lighting can also make a big difference in any and all storytelling you're trying to do. Just like in movies, you want to be deliberate with your lighting so that it fits the story you're trying to tell. Now, in this video, we're going to take a look at a couple of essential lighting techniques for lighting up your interior scenes. Typically, it all starts with your environmental lighting, so your sky and sun essentially. And here, there's two main techniques you can use: HDR lighting and a procedural sun and sky system. HDRIs, or high dynamic range images, are super common, and what they are basically photo captured images that contain 32 bits of data and multiple exposures baked into a single photo. They are popular because not only do you get a nice background in your scene this way, but also because typically all the clouds and gradients in the sky are, well, pretty much just like they are in the real world. Plus, alongside that, you sometimes can get the ground level in as well. And ultimately, you just get a rather complex, full of variety environmental light setup just by simply importing your HDRI of choice into your scene. Now, the way you set them up in V-Ray is you bring in a V-Ray dome light, you hop into the V-Ray node editor, enable light nodes, and then you bring in the HDRI as a V-Ray bitmap. Make sure it's set to linear here, and then just connect it to the dome color. And if you want to rotate the thing now, just rotate the dome light in your viewport. Now, where can you find HDRIs? Well, there's plenty of websites online that allow you to get or buy one. But you can also get them in Chaos Cosmos, where you get these neat looking previews, and the import process is super straightforward. You just import it, and it's in your scene. The downsides of HDRIs, however, are mainly that you're dealing with fixed images, meaning you can't really customize things like the position of the sun on the sky or the sky itself. And that is where the procedural V-Ray sun and sky system comes in, because it grants you a lot more of that customization control. With this thing, you get a separate control over your sun's position, as well as its color, intensity, and also the size of the sun, which can, for example, make for softer shadows, which simulates an overcasty sky. And then you get pretty much complete control over the sky as well, where you can change the intensity, the altitude you're at, and a bunch of other things. Now in V-Ray, all you need to do is you need to bring in the V-Ray sun and sky system. And just like that, if you now move the sun around the scene, the sun will, well, move. You can customize any of the sun settings, which really gives you a lot of control to get to the look you want. Now in the V-Ray node editor, when in world mode, if you unlink the V-Ray sun from the sky, you can then also tweak just about everything in the way your sky works. And there is a lot you can tweak if you so want to or need to. Now, in case you're wondering, unlinking the sun from the sky means that the sky won't realistically adapt to the sun's position in the sky. So a sun that is about to sunset will look like that, but the sky won't. Okay, now a lot of the times you'll also want to have artificial lighting turned on in your scenes. And so that typically refers to interior lighting of any sorts. Ceiling lights, desk lamps, standing lights, you name it. The way you light these can be done in a variety of different ways, but arguably two are the most common. You can place an emissive material on the emissive parts of the actual light bulb, which typically works fine, but might really increase the render times. So alternatively, what you can do is you can bring in a V-Ray material in here, okay, plug it into that material output slot, and then we're going to play with the self-illumination color. We're just going to give it the same color that our light material previously had, and then we're also going to make sure that the self-illumination in here is checked to off, okay. Now, what we can do, and we've already done that, is we're going to place sphere lights, area sphere lights around our light sources here. Now we're just going to enable them, and as you can see, that then performs quite a bit better. Now on top of that, what you can also do is you can create a bit of a blend material for the actual sort of lighting fixtures themselves. So we have this main V-Ray material, which is our base material here, and then we've pre-prepared a V-Ray light material here. We're going to plug into the coat material 1 slot. So this is just a regular light material, and this is going to kind of further help sell the effect that these lights are actually on, and everything's still going to be very, very performant. And we can control how much how that blending goes between the standard V-Ray material. So if we just go with full white, as you can see, we're just seeing this light material here, and then if we go with full black, and then we just see that, you know, that translucent, I guess, fabricy material in this case. But if we want to sell the effect like that these are on, we can just, you know, up the blend amount here a little bit, and, you know, that looks more like the lights are actually on. And so that's just a couple of different ways on how you can optimize a setup like this for performance. For when it comes to artificial lighting, most commonly you're just trying to make things look realistic and in tune with the rest of the lighting in your scene. So pretty much the same principles you'd apply on a real world set. Now, sometimes, however, you'll want to bring in fake lights as well. The lights that light up parts of your scene in order to accentuate the existing lighting that isn't so strong, or to add some additional lighting where there isn't enough, but you could use it to make the image more aesthetically pleasing. The principles are the same. You take an area light, you place it where you want it to be, and then you make it invisible. Whether you want it to be seen in the reflections or refractions is up to you and your use case, obviously. Now, operating so many lights and changing their intensities and colors can be rather time consuming, even on a fast machine. So instead of having to update the render every time you make a change to your light's intensity or color, you can just use V-Ray's light mix functionality. Now, to get light mix going, what you'll want to do is you're going to want to go under the view layer here and then toggle light mix to on, and then you can either start the interactive renderer or the production renderer. With this thing, you can fine-tune the lighting in your scene without having to re-render the changes. It's all done on the image that's already being rendered or has finished rendering. So this way you can really fine-tune the lighting without having to lose too much time waiting for the renderer to update. It is truly an incredibly awesome feature. And yes, it is physically accurate. We won't bore you with the math here, but suffice it to say, the math does its thing and the results are the same as if you'd be tweaking your light properties directly. Essential camera techniques that will hopefully help you create more realistic looking render. Sometimes you got the lighting in a good place. The materials are all but finished, but the image really doesn't look quite that realistic yet. And with these basic techniques, we are going to try and help you add that little bit of extra realism to it all. Now, one of the most important aspects when it comes to creating pleasant and realistic looking imagery is getting the exposure right. Now, getting the exposure right is most certainly a creative endeavor, but typically speaking, an underexposed image is less than ideal. An overexposed image is also typically less than ideal, of course, unless that helps you convey a certain emotion or mood. Now, to control the exposure in V-Ray, you got a couple of different options to choose from. So what you want to do here is you want to select your camera, go into its properties, and then just toggle the V-Ray physical camera to on, go under color and exposure here, and then here you're going to be able to see that you have this exposure mode. Currently it's set to no exposure, which means none of the settings in here are going to affect the exposure in your camera, but you can change this to, for example, exposure value. And now you're adjusting the exposure on your camera using this exposure value parameter input field. So lower values mean brighter image, higher values mean a dimmer image. Alternatively, you can also set the exposure mode here to physical exposure, and now you're controlling the exposure in the image using these aperture parameters in here. So the same sort of parameters you would use on a real world camera. So just to demo it, if we up the ISO, the image is going to get brighter. If we lower the F number, for example, the image is going to get brighter. And if we, for example, go with a slower shutter speed, well, then the image is going to get really bright. Another way to control your exposure is through the VFB itself. You can simply add the exposure layer, which should typically be the first in the stack, and then you can mess with the exposure slider in there, and that will work as you would expect it to. It will adjust the exposure in your image. Plus, it also works regardless of the camera exposure mode you're in, so do keep that in mind. Now, needless to say, any of the modes you opt to go with that we showcase here are physically accurate, and where they differ is just in the way that you get to that result of controlling your exposure, just different ways of controlling your exposure. Okay, now another important bit that will help add realism to your images is going to be the way that your images get tone mapped. The example in front of us right now is an example of an image that arguably has nicely set exposure, but as you can see, the highlights, so the brightest parts of the image, are just way too strong. It's almost like they're radiating light, plus things kind of look posterized. And so every rendered image should have some form of tone mapping applied to it so that in the end it looks more like a photo would look like. Now in V-Ray you have a couple of different ways to tone map your image. One of them is to just simply bring in the exposure layer and then just lower the highlight burn here to a point where you're kind of happy with it. And as you can see, these highlights look a lot more controlled now. Now, another way to tone map your image is by the use of the filmic tone map layer. So by default, the type here is set to Hable, and this gives you quite a bit of control and a very specific look that's, well, Hable-like. You can switch the type here from Hable to Ampus, for example. This is that ACES tone mapping look, but it really doesn't give you any control. Bottom line, you probably will want to experiment with all these different options depending on the visual style that you're going for. Broadly speaking, the filmic tone map, what it does is it rolls off the highlights and controls the shadows in a way so that the image then a little bit more resembles an image that was created on film or on a film-like camera, broadly speaking. Now, for when it comes to realism, another important thing to consider is the actual lens you are using. Okay, so with this particular camera here, we're using a lens with a focal length of 50 millimeters. And as you can see, the image is sort of balanced in some ways. So the edges aren't too distorted and the sort of depth in the image is not too compressed. We can make out the distance, but that the distance between the bowl and the sofa here is, well, there is some distance between the two. Now, what we could do here is we could go with a focal length of, let's say, 150 millimeters. In this case, we would have to pull the camera backwards quite a little bit, but observe how, we're basically standing in the angle of this, the corner of this room. And observe what happens here is everything is very, very compressed. There's almost no depth in the image. which might be the look that you're going for detailed shots. A lot of the times this is sort of what you want, but a focal length of 150 millimeters is probably not quite as realistic for an interior image such as this one, even for close-ups. So that's something to keep in mind, right? You do want to use a tele lens, maybe 80 millimeters. That might be a little bit more fitting for this use case, or maybe 100 millimeters or something like that. But 150 or 200 would probably be too much, and you probably wouldn't use that kind of a lens in the real world. Alternatively, you probably also wouldn't use a 15 millimeter lens for a close-up image, right? In this case, as you can see, the borders of the image are distorted. The sofa compared to the bowl seems really far away, etc., etc. Now, you could use a lens like this in the real world, but typically for close-ups and for these types of images, you don't. And so that's why this might feel off and not necessarily quite as realistic looking. Now, much like you can in the real world, you can use the different lenses to convey different senses of scale or invoke different emotions in the viewers by, for example, having a 20 millimeter lens close to a rather small toy, which can make it feel bigger than it is. Where this affects the realism in your scenes if you use unrealistic values that wouldn't be quite common in the real world, or they wouldn't be possible in the real world. So visual references of real world photos can be of great help here, as well as you actually owning a camera and trying to snap pictures with it. Now, of course, rules are meant to be broken, so you should experiment with unorthodox lenses and unorthodox positioning, but it's also cool to stay grounded. Okay, now another tip would be to always try and have your depth of field effect turned on. In this image, the depth of field really adds a lot to make things look more realistic and more interesting visually speaking. There's also storytelling aspects to using depth of field as well, but in the context of this tutorial, we'll focus just on the realism bit. So on a real world camera, you can't disable depth of field, and so it is suggested to also try and have it on in the CG world as well. Here's an example of a photo taken in the real world. And notice how even though the furniture is sort of the focus point, you can see that the sofa is more in focus than the chair in front of it. Now, yes, you could opt for a wider lens or a different f-stop value on your camera, but the point is there's always going to be a bit of depth of field that is softening parts of your image. But now, how do you turn it on in V-Ray? Well, it's real simple. Just go into your physical camera settings, go all the way down here to where it says depth of field and motion blur, and then just toggle depth of field to on. And just like that, you're gonna have depth of field in your image. Now, you're probably gonna wanna control the focus distance. You can do that using the focus distance parameter here. You can input the distance manually, if that's what you would like, or you can set it to focus on a specific object, right? Alternatively, the quickest way is to just simply right-click on your viewport rendered image and select the depth of field distance pick option, okay? And then you can just pick wherever you want the focus distance to be at. In this case, we picked this part of the leaf here, and now this leaf is in focus. Now, another thing to keep in mind with your depth of field is to try and stick to reasonable f-stop and lens combinations. So if you go with a really silly wide-angle lens and a weirdly low f-stop value, you'll get unrealistic looking images because those types of combinations just aren't common or sometimes even possible in the real world. So having some hands-on camera experience in the real world can be immensely valuable as you operate your virtual camera in your CG world. We'll be taking a look at a couple of key post-production techniques that one should probably be aware of. Without any post-production, these are typically the kinds of images you get out of your renders. The highlights are overblown and they don't really have that nice soft roll-off we typically see on film or photo. The darker areas are rather harsh as well, and the overall image just doesn't look that appealing, and it has no color grading applied at all. So in this video, we'll show you how you can get from this to something more pleasant looking like the image you see in front of you right now. To do that, we'll focus our attention on the V-Ray VFB, which amongst other things it allows you to do, you can kind of think of as your post-production suite right inside V-Ray. All right, so first up, we'll start with tone mapping our image. That will take care of those highlights and shadows so that the image looks more natural. Now, there's multiple different ways on how you can tone map your image. You can use curves, etc., etc. But one of the easiest is to just simply add a filmic tone map layer to the stack, and then you can choose between the different types of tone mapping options that you have available here. They differ by look and also by the amount of control they give you. So if we, for example, select Ampus here, you can see Ampus has no control. And by the way, just in case you're into that ACES look, this mimics that, okay? But as you can see, it doesn't give you any sort of control. Then if you use, for example, or if you switch over to Hable, well, as you can see, you got a lot of controls to play with here to get to the look you want. So different types, different looks, and different controls. So what I'm going to opt for here myself is Hale and Dawson. So I just personally kind of like this one for this particular image. You don't have to marry yourself to a specific type. But just kind of what works best for you. And just maybe as a note, if you're searching for that Reinhardt mapping, so that a bit more non-filmic and a bit more old school mapping, switch to linear here, and then you have your highlight burn here, which is basically a Reinhardt sort of mapping, right? So just in case you're interested in that specific look, you do have it here under linear, okay? But as said, I'm going to go with Hale and Dawson here. I think that works best. Now, one thing that you're gonna notice is that this image is a little bit dark. Now, we could go back into our camera settings and readjust the exposure there, or what we could also do is we could introduce an exposure layer to the stack here. But one thing to note here is that if you're doing filmic tone mapping, do note that that will compress your image. So if you put exposure after the filmic tone map happens, well, then the exposure is really not going to work as you need it to, right? But the way to solve that is for you to just move the exposure to be first in the stack or below the filmic tone map, where you have that full dynamic range of your image, okay? And so this then makes the exposure layer work as you would expect it to. So now, as you can see, our image went from this untone mapped image where, you know, the highlights were all kind of odd and shadows were, you know, not that cool looking, to something a bit more pleasant, right? And you've seen how easy it was to do that. Okay, so that super important step is now done. And next up, we'll focus on lens effects. Okay, so to enable the lens effects, just select the lens effect layer here and click on enable lens effects. And just like that, you have your lens effects. Now you can tweak this. You've got a lot of controls here. They are really fun to tweak. So you can do lens scratches. And if you just go to the bottom here, you can see the effect the lens scratches have on your aperture. So you have an aperture preview here, and you can see how that affects the actual lens effects themselves, right? So this is quite speedy. And in my case here, I think I'm gonna enable lens dust because it kind of makes this bloom a little bit more spread out. You can tweak all of these settings if you want to. You can have a filter image obstacle, etc., etc. There's a lot of fun to be had here. So we would definitely encourage you to play around in here. Another thing that I will turn on here, however, is the chromatic aberration, just so we get these nice effects along the edges of where the bright image meets the darker, which is a very realistic effect. And, you know, if you're into realism, you want this to an extent in every image that you create, right? All right, okay, so the image is already looking pretty cool, but we're not done yet because I think we could still color correct it a bit and introduce some sort of color grading on it. Okay, so color corrections work pretty much how you would expect them to. You add any of the color correction layers. So for example, hue and saturation, you add that into the stack. Now, if you play with the saturation, well, guess what? You're going to be affecting the saturation in your image. You can change the hue, etc., etc. And so you have a bunch of these kinds of layers. So you can do color balance as well. So if you want to make the shadows a little bit more red-ish, you can do that. And so that's generally how you would color correct pretty much any image inside the VFB. You bring in the layer you want, and then you tweak it. Now, one thing that our users very much like is also the ability to add lookup tables into the mix. So we're gonna select the lookup table layer here. I'm gonna paste the link to my LUT file into the field here, and I'm gonna switch this to work in sRGB. And now, as you can see, we're color grading our image with this specific LUT, right? Now, in case you aren't familiar with LUTs, they are essentially these rather small .cube or .look or .3dl files where you got your color corrections, color grades, contrast, and tonal changes sort of baked in. And so when you apply a LUT, you apply all of those changes to your image using that single file. Now, typically in professional sort of high-end workflows, you develop a LUT specifically for your image or sometimes even a project as a whole. So you do all the color balance, curve adjustments, etc., and then you bake that into a LUT, and then you use that single LUT file on your images instead of recreating all of those changes, all those curves and all that by hand every single time. That said, in practice, you can also grab a LUT online. A lot of people are selling them, and apply those to your image. That then results in your image having a certain look that the original author of the LUT developed. Now, in practice, this is a bit trickier in the sense that every LUT gets developed for a specific input. So be it different cameras, different renders, different image files, and all that. But even so, if you want to quickly transfer a color grade from someone else, then yeah, that's what a lot of people do. And broadly, it works just fine. You can sort of think of this workflow as filters on popular social media platforms. Now, one thing to note here is that you need to be aware of in what sort of space each LUT is designed to work in. So most of the LUTs that you get online, broadly speaking, I guess my impression is that they're designed to work in the sRGB sort of mode. But you do get LUTs that also work in log or in linear. And there's kind of no way of telling typically by the name because people just don't put that in there. But you do want to make sure that you get this correctly. Otherwise, you might get a weird looking image. Okay. Now, typically also once you introduce LUTs, you will probably want to go back and tweak the exposure a little bit depending on the LUT that you're using. So in my case here, I'm just going to lower the exposure a little bit. And maybe what we could also do here is we could lower the contrast just a little bit. Obviously, these are subjective sort of creative decisions that I'm making here. You might not agree with them, but you know, this is typically what happens when you start playing with LUTs. Main thing here is hopefully you can see how easy it is to achieve a certain look with the help of LUTs. And if you develop your own LUTs, well then really you probably already know the power of LUTs in general. Now, maybe just as a bit of a quick tip, do make sure that save in image is toggled to on when you're in the LUT layer. Otherwise, the LUT layer is not going to get saved into your image when you're saving the image out. So do keep that in mind. All right, cool. So now we, generally speaking, know the general color correction workflows in V-Ray for Blender. But one thing we still haven't explored is the masking ability that the VFB gives you. With it, you can confine pretty much all of the layers in the VFB to work on just specific parts of the image. Meaning you can, for example, color correct just parts of the image. Okay, so to get masking working, you need some sort of a mask pass. So in our case here, we're going to go into our view layers and we're going to enable the Cryptomatte mask, okay, or Cryptomatte matte. You can also alternatively, just so you know, go and use the V-Ray node editor, be in world mode, and then you can add a Cryptomatte in this way as well, whichever way works better for you, just so you know, right? That's the same thing as, you know, the node editor. So once you have that set up, in our case here, we're going to be using a Cryptomatte. You could be using different options, but we're going to use Cryptomatte because it's the most versatile. And now what you got to do is you got to jump into your camera and start the interactive render. So not the viewport render, but interactive render. Okay, that's going to be a really important step. Otherwise, the masking options are not really going to work. So interactive rendering is what you want to do. And now, obviously, we need to wait for the render to start. Okay, so here we are. We kind of sped up the video or cut the video. Don't really know at this point, just so you don't have to wait for the render to restart, right? Anyhow, now let's say, for example, we want to adjust the hue of these leaves here on this plant. Okay, so what we're going to do is I'm going to bring in a hue and saturation layer. Then I'm going to click on this button right here, which is the mask button. So as you can see, you can do different kinds of masks. You can do a multi-matte mask, etc., etc. But we opted for the Cryptomatte. And so we're going to click on Cryptomatte, and now we're going to click the select the picker here, and we're gonna simply pick the leaves. Now, if you want to see, and if you want to make sure that what you've picked is indeed what you've picked, you can select this show preview when selected. And you can, as you can see, that's exactly what's happening here. You can also invert the mask, just so you know. But anyhow, we've now selected this plant to be our mask. And now if we go back to our hue and saturation layer, we can now, for example, start messing with the hue. And as you can see, let's just make this really funky. As you can see, it's only affecting the leaves, right? And so as you can see with the Cryptomatte, this was really easy to set up. And this just, opens up a lot of interesting sort of post-production color correction workflows for you, because it's easy to mask things and it's easy to, color correct things this way. So in my opinion, this is a really useful feature. And there we have it. We are at the end of this tutorial. We hope you've learned something new here. We hope you've enjoyed watching the video. And if you'd like to share your creations, renders that you make, please head over on our forums. We have a gallery section there. Or if you have any questions, comments, criticisms, well, we do read the comments underneath these videos. Thank you so much for tuning in. We will see you in the next one.